Fillet of fenny snake in the cauldron, boil and bake. I have newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, adder's fork and blindworm's sting, lizard's leg and howlet's wing, for a charm of powerful trouble, like hell broth boil and bubble. This brew be ye only salvation. We're scaring up a good time.
Engage your brain and enter
The mind's eye.
your one-stop shop for politics to paranormal and everything in between. I'm your host, Brian Turnov, and you're listening to Z Talk Radio. If you can't tell by my festive mood, it's October 27th, and we're just a few short days away from one of my favorite holidays, Halloween. And it's not just any old Halloween episode. This is our Heroes Halloween episode. Ghosts, supernatural, spirits, haunted locations, the dead, apparitions, specters, evil forces, phantoms. Most of us are fascinated by these things, but even the most ardent paranormal investigator and the most engaged person in the supernatural, most of the time when you hear these stories, you're going to roll your eyes. Because like anything else, you have to look at the source and see how reliable it is. And that's where our theme, Heroes Halloween, comes into play. We have a fantastic double shot tonight for you. Our two guests, not only do they keep the streets safe, but their professional backgrounds particularly deal with that veil between life and death. In the first hour, we welcome Richard Estep, paramedic and volunteer firefighter by day, paranormal investigator by night. He'll give us a spine-tingling, behind-the-scenes tour of one of the world's most haunted buildings, Asylum 49. Richard's going to share some of his creepiest experiences, featured from his book, The Haunting of Asylum 49, Chilling Tales of Aggressive Spirits, Phantom Doctors, and the Secret of Room 666. We'll follow that up with retired police officer and best-selling author Lauren W. Christensen. He's going to discuss his recently released book, Cops' True Stories of the Paranormal, Ghosts, UFOs, and Other Shivers. These are the veteran officer stories. They've been there, they've done that, but on one occasion, they were confronted with the unexplained. Stay tuned for some blood-curdling spirit stories. This is The Mind's Eye Halloween Special. I know you've heard this 1,000 times before, but there actually has been a real break in the infamous Jack the Ripper case. U.S.-based private investigator Randy Williams presents a shocking new theory that Jack the Ripper was actually 3 men. After reading the article, I gotta admit the evidence is pretty darn tantalizing, and top Ripper experts not only agree, but are taking note. Great articles like these, politics to paranormal and everything in between. Follow or like us on our social media pages, facebook.com/Mind's Eye Show, and the same for our Twitter handle, @Mind's Eye Show. And if you don't do the social media thing, no problem there. Go to our website, themindseyemedia.com. All right, with no further delay, our Halloween heroes, paramedic Richard Estep and retired officer Lauren Christensen. They're going to share their haunted tales after a word from our sponsors. This is The Mind's Eye. Paramedic and volunteer firefighter by day, paranormal investigator by night, always a writer. Richard Estep, welcome to The Mind's Eye.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back, sir.
I love having you on. I'm excited to talk about the topic and your book. But before we talk about your book, I want to get to know you a little bit more and find out how your interest in the paranormal started. At what point would you say you really started? I guess, when did your love and interest start? And what point would you say you really started investigating seriously?
Well, I was always interested in this kind of stuff ever since I was a boy, because I grew up in a house that was supposedly very haunted, or at least I would spend weekends there. It was one of my grandparents' houses, and it was haunted by the ghost of an old lady that used to be very maternal towards the children of the family. And so I found these stories fascinating. I heard them from my grandparents, from my aunts, my uncles, my stepdad, and I always kind of hoped I might run into her, and yet kind of wished that I wouldn't too. And it sparked, and I never did. It seems that when my various aunts and uncles grew up and moved out, had their own families, that she either dissipated or she found something else to do. She seemed to have moved on, and the house was never active afterwards. But it sparked that lifelong love of all things paranormal.
Now that you've been investigating for 2+ decades, you obviously have many strategies that you probably try to use at hand to link possible paranormal activity to history. Did you ever go back and look at the history of the house of where you grew up to see if there was any links there?
You know, it's believed that it's the former owner that hanged herself, and there is one story I've heard. Another is that she died of natural causes. So I've heard two versions of the story and wasn't able to tell which was which, but either way, a former tenant that died in the house.
In what ways would you say investigating the paranormal has, particularly ghost, because we know that the paranormal is a wide spectrum, has really had an influence on your life, both negatively and positively?
Well, I think it's generally overwhelmingly positive, leaving aside the fact that it's given me a writing career and given me the opportunity to appear on a TV show that covers my work. I think it teaches me to be interested in people and stories. The more you look at history, the more you delve into history, we see why there are ghosts. You know, we look at all the drama of human existence. We see that this is a phenomenon that's as old as humanity itself. The very first ghost stories come to us from Rome, from Greece, from antiquity. And so it's gotten me fascinated in the story of human lives. Every human life is a story, and some of them, I think, leave a more indelible mark than others do.
I've been saying, if I had to add in, I mean, obviously everything you said is positive. I've done a bit of paranormal investigating since 2008. Nothing to the probably extensive amount that you have done, particularly the amount of locations. But I would say the one thing that is negative is that you put in, at least in my experiences, of course, doing this, you put in so much work, and really like 999 times out of 1,000 times, nothing will happen, but it'll be that briefest of moments that you get that something, but there's just so much time and effort that you have to get it, that it's almost fleeting in that sense.
Well, you know, it's very much like being part of the fire service. As a firefighter, we don't spend all that much time on actual fires, believe it or not. We spend a lot of our time training, we spend a fair amount cleaning, doing administrative stuff. We do a lot of public education, and it's a very small subset of what we do is true life and death work, the stuff that you train for. So we spend, I think, 90% of our time training for 10% of what we actually do in that regard. But it's also a very rewarding 10% when it goes well and you get to genuinely help someone. So it's not a bad analogy for the paranormal research, is that we spend 90% of our time in the dark, or kind of tirelessly ruling things out, waiting for things to happen, debunking, finding natural explanations. And when you sift through all of that, what remains, that 5, maybe 10% that's inexplicable, is what truly fascinates me.
So we're doing a double shot tonight on our Halloween celebration. Our other guest right after you is retired police officer Lauren Christensen. He just came out with a book, Cops True Paranormal Studies. But he wrote his after retirement. I mean, you're still active and, you know, fairly well-known writer in the paranormal community. So you're not exactly hiding at the moment. You ever catch any grief from paramedic coworkers, or even conversely, some of them come up to you on the side and say, you know, this unexplainable thing happened to me?
You know, I don't so much catch any grief. There's some good-natured ribbing and humor and stuff like that whenever something like this comes up, of course. But what kind of makes me laugh is I deal with people that are very skeptical quite often, and they'll say, that's it's kind of a bunch of garbage, really, isn't it? Or ghosts and goblins. It's kind of childish. Maybe you need to grow up a little bit. And then, in the same breath, almost, they'll say, anyway, I once worked at this hospital, and they'll go on and tell me a story that happened either to them or to somebody they knew. So it seems like everybody, even the most hard-boiled skeptic, has an experience or knows somebody that has an experience. It seems to be almost a universal phenomenon.
Well, let's get to the soup du jour, and as you alluded to a hospital. Let's get to your book specifically, why we invited you on. The Haunting of Asylum 49, Chilling Tales of Aggressive Spirits, Phantom Doctors, and The Secret of Room 666. So when did you originally hear about Asylum 49, and who clued you in on the location and the activity there?
Well, I was writing my last book called The World's Most Haunted Hospitals, most appropriately. And so I was looking around the world at various haunted locations. I was looking in the Far East. I was looking at Australia. I wanted to cast a broad net. But I knew that I would not have the opportunity to travel to places other than the UK and the United States to some of the locations. And so when I was looking at some locations closer to home, one that came up was the old Tuella Valley Hospital outside Salt Lake City in Utah, which was about 500 miles away from where I live. And so I was impressed with what I had heard about it. I'd seen a couple of TV shows which covered it, read a few reports, and decided I'd like to check it out for myself. And I reached out to the owners, and they said, hey, you're more than welcome to come take a look yourself. And I love that kind of answer, because rather than try and sell me on a story, they said, hey, if you want, bring some equipment, bring some colleagues, come on down, and you let us know what you find. And who's going to turn that down? So I did go down for a day in the spring last year. We made a 1,000-mile round trip for one night, and it was quiet as the grave, no pun intended. The hospital actually sits next to the town cemetery. They're neighbors. It was quiet, nothing really paranormal at all. But I did get a chance to go through the archives and look at their photographic evidence, look at some of their security camera footage, which has picked up anomalous figures, and also to listen to some of their EVPs. And the owners, when I told them, hey, nothing really happened, I'm afraid, they said, well, listen, I think that's because you're here in off-season. We're now in March of this year, March, April, end of March, early April, the exact date eludes me right now. But they said, we're pretty quiet. There's virtually nobody in here most of the time. You need to come back when we're open, because this hospital is a Halloween haunted house attraction. So it is a haunted house. Which just sold me right away. I mean, it's the only place I've ever investigated where you turn a corner and you run into a zombie quite regularly.
It's like meta paranormal, right?
Yeah, it's kind of strange. So it's a very, very cool location. I mean, there is one room you have to be very careful. I put my foot on this pressure plate and a werewolf jumped out from underneath the bed.
So right now, so are there people right now doing the same exact thing? Like right now, the hospital is being used as a Halloween. Yep. That's great.
Yep, that's happening right now. So for basically 3 months of the year, they have close to 40,000 people come through.
Wow.
And these people are all coming through with one purpose: to be scared. That's what they're paying for. So I think that's why the asylum's so active when it's the busy tourist season. So the owner said, you need to come back, but you should come back when we're at our height, at our busiest. And I said, that's a great idea. That means Halloween, right? And they said, yeah. So I said, okay, well, it's a long way to come just for Halloween night, as cool as that would be. Will you let me move in for a week? And to their credit, they did. They said, yeah, bring in a team, move in for a week, we'll give you the keys, come and go as you please, and again, figure out what you find. And I quickly realized, as I researched the place, as we investigated, that a chapter in a book could not do this location justice. It needed its own book to tell the story. And that's the genesis of The Haunting of Asylum 49.
Wow, so it's great to hear that. People who are listening right now, hey, if you happen to be in that area, go check it out and see where the proof is really in the pudding. Tell me a little bit more about the history of Asylum 49, because we know people with the paranormal experience that the history is so important with linking it to the paranormal as at least some form of support.
Yeah, well, being an old hospital, I mean, a lot of hospitals are haunted. I learned that, when I wrote The World's Most Haunted Hospitals, for reasons that should be fairly obvious. And so the Tooele Valley Hospital, it had plenty of deaths, plenty of births, the whole spectrum of human life, of drama. It was the stage for all of that. And it's been my experience that where one finds strong emotion, especially a great deal of it, one generally also finds ghosts, which is why we see so many haunted battlefields, of course, and hotels and places like that. So the history of the place is that it was really a community hospital until 2004, 2005, when it was supplanted by a newer, larger facility, and kind of entered that death spiral that some hospitals do, where the staff take jobs elsewhere, and ended up kind of closing its doors for the last time about 10 years ago, 11 years ago now. And what's interesting is that when you walk in, everything was just left behind. So they didn't take the equipment with them. There is an ER there with ER beds and those lights on swivel arms that still work. There are defibrillators in there. There is all of this equipment, the original patient beds, the original x-ray suite, for goodness sake, is all still there. And I think it's a lot of that residual, kind of energy has remained behind with it.
How you wrote the book with the owner, Cammy Anderson. How did she come to get a hold of the place and own them?
Well, Cammy's an investigator in her own right, so we were on the same wavelength, and she very kindly, and it had impressed me that during the writing of Most Haunted Hospital, she answered my questions, but basically said, investigate for yourself. And that was good, because she wasn't trying to ram this ghost story down my throat. But when it came to actually telling the story of the place, telling the history of the location, who better as a co-author than a co-owner of the hospital, So she and her husband Kim and some other family members had purchased this place wanting to turn it into a Halloween haunted house. They had some experience with that. And so that's kind of what happened. And it was after the fact that they realized, hey, this place actually is haunted.
The history of mental health therapy in America is actually terrifying. I mean, we talk about spooky stories and ghosts and all that stuff, but truth is stranger and more terrifying than fiction. We know that there were some pretty despicable medical experiments done in the past. Was this one of those type of places? Lobotomies, things of that nature?
It wasn't, and this is kind of an interesting thing to bring up, because I lectured on this subject recently at DragonCon in Atlanta. So you're right, you're absolutely right. And mental health is still to this day a science that is in its relative infancy. There are so many conditions we cannot cure and many that we can barely treat. But when this began, mental health institutions, and Asylum 49 was not one of those, but those kind of institutions were more places to benefit society than the patients. People would essentially be thrown away out of society's sight, and the key would be thrown away. You locked people up, you got rid of them. And what went on behind those doors was not as closely questioned or scrutinized as it should have been. So we saw very barbaric procedures like the ice pick lobotomy, where an ice pick would be driven into the socket of the eye, through the eye socket into the brain, in order to try and moderate certain mental impulses. And you're right, it's absolutely horrific and barbaric. But there's one thing I do love to point out when we talk about this subject. The men and women that did those procedures were, as far as they were concerned, we're not talking about villains here that are twirling their mustaches. They're not horror movie butchers. They were using the state of the art, the state of science at the time as it was understood. They were employing what they thought were beneficial techniques. They were good men and women working with just a very rudimentary level of medical research at the time. And I always think it's important because we do tend to kind of vilify those institutions. And it's true, there was some abuse that went on in those facilities. I uncovered a bunch of that when I investigated in order for the world's most haunted hospitals. But good people who really didn't know any better is generally the story.
It's like any other institution. 99% of that institution, they're just trying to do the right thing. Maybe sometimes bad things happen because of lack of knowledge, for example, here. But there is always that 1% that is doing things. But, for the most part, 99%, they're always just trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. Let me give you a good example. When I went to paramedic school, On the first day, they said 30% of what we're going to teach you is wrong. And we apologize because we don't know which 30% that is. And they went on to explain that, medicine is a dynamic field, it moves on. And so what today's studies indicate, and that's what we base treatments on, in 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years, may be laughed at by the medical community. And just even a cursory review of the history of medicine kind of bears that out, doesn't it? Some of the things that have been used as cures and treatments in the past, we now look at them and say, what were they thinking? But medicine is as much of an art as it is a science.
And obviously you would know that much more intimately than the rest of us. So clearly, so let's stop delaying. Let's get into the paranormal part. It is our Halloween celebration. This is what the people want to hear. With Asylum 49, I forgot what you didn't mention. What year did it open?
1949.
1949.
Was the hospital, which is why Asylum 49.
They're not trying to trick anybody there with that one.
No, there aren't 48 other asylums.
Okay. How do the reports of unexplainable and what we consider paranormal activity date?
Well, there have been anecdotal stories from people that worked at the hospital, but it seems that it really went into high gear after the place was abandoned and then repurposed as a haunted house attraction. So we have a good decade's worth of eyewitness testimony and photographs and other evidence to kind of back that up to accompany it.
You've investigated on both sides of the Atlantic. Like we said, you've been doing it for 2 decades now. In your opinion, why is Asylum 49 so different or special in regards to its paranormal phenomena?
Well, you've seen that movie, The Perfect Storm. Okay, so the concept of a perfect storm, when all of those factors kind of roll in together and they create this very active storm that's more than the sum of its parts almost. I think it's a good analogy for what's happening here. Firstly, you have the old hospital with its history. It's very kind of storied history of life and death and the things that any hospital really has that's fairly busy. Then you have the fact that it's co-located with the town cemetery, and the missing piece of this puzzle is that at the back of the building, still directly connected to it by doors which are locked at all times, is a retirement home. So you have a bunch of senior citizens that have been living there also, and activity is also being reported there, although that facility is moving to a new location early next year. So you have all of that is your kind of groundwork, your basis, and then you have tens of thousands of people coming through during the Halloween season thinking about ghosts, thinking about getting scared. They have the intention of getting scared, and I think it all comes together in this perfect storm and allows the activity to manifest.
Is there one particularly terrifying or unexplainable experience that you had? I mean, you lived there for a week, you visited the night before, so you obviously got comfortable. If there are spirits there, they got comfortable with you. Is there one thing in your mind that, I guess, keeps you up at night?
I brought something home with me, which is the single thing. I've been investigating for 20 years, and I'd never had any kind of attachment or brought anything home. And when you do paranormal research, if you try and do anything protective, it's usually not a bad idea, even if it's a statement of intent that nothing may accompany you home. But I'd never had that happen in 20 years. And then after spending that time at the asylum, we started to have some very odd activity in the November to December of last year around my house, which culminated in a woman's voice being heard by my wife, by my dog, who went berserk when this voice was heard downstairs. I came running downstairs with her hackles up in full-on attack mode. There was nothing there, nobody there. We had pictures falling off of the mantelpiece and shattering. And then my wife woke up in the middle of the night and she saw a figure standing over her in the bed. And that's when she said, "This is enough. We need to do something here." And I'm a card-carrying agnostic. I don't profess to a specific belief system, but I'm open to belief anyway. I called a friend of mine who, in addition to being a paranormal investigator, is a Catholic priest. And he kindly came and blessed the house, after which the activity stopped.
There were so many, and you investigated at the location so many times, you encountered so many different things. Do you think there was one specific entity that you encountered that came back with you? Do you know who it was, possibly?
I don't. There are some entities that are nicer than others. I do know that the children which haunt the hospital tend to be the ones which travel the most often, or at least based on reports that the owners get. But the voice that was heard in the house by my wife was a woman's voice, a grown woman's voice, as opposed to a child's. So I don't know of any kind of adult female entities there. Most of them seem to be males or children's. So the jury is kind of still out on who or what that was.
Do you think that when you're investigating the paranormal, you said that you got this attachment from it. Do you think that maybe the attachment wasn't even from the location, that now that you stepped through that door, that there was no going back, and that anything at any moment can come attach you? And I don't mean to, in that sense, or scaremonger.
Well, last year was a banner year for me, and I hit a number of items on my bucket list. I'd done Bobby Mackey's Music World. I'm sure you're familiar with that, in Wilder, Kentucky.
Of course.
Which is the one place where the Ghost Adventures guys refused to return. I'd done Waverly Hills Sanatorium. I'd done some cases in the UK as well. I'd investigated Asylum 49 and the Cripple Creek Jail, where my doppelganger was seen, which was kind of interesting. But Asylum 49 was the last case, the last major case that I broke last year. And so I suspect that's why things started happening after I've been to Asylum 49. But there's no way to tell for sure, I guess.
No, of course. I mean, there's just no. It's all subjectivity when it really comes down to it. What about your co-author Cammie, and of course, who is the owner of Asylum 49? If she were here right now, what would she say was her most frightening experience?
Well, she and her husband live next door. They are neighbors to the place, so they kind of live in that in close proximity to it all the time. But her husband Kim, who is also the owner of the asylum, had a dark entity follow him home, and that pinned him down in bed, which he found quite frightening, quite unnerving, and I don't say I blame him in the slightest.
Yeah, I mean, I would find that a bit unnerving, to say the least. In all the thousands of hours that I've investigated, I've never had anything like that happen to me. I mean, there was a brief moment, 15 to 45 seconds or so, where something happened that I can't explain, which I got on tape, but never something to that effect. What about actually at the location? You said something attached to you. Do you remember something that happened at the location that just completely stunned you?
Well, we had a few experiences, and perhaps my favorite was the experiment we did in the old emergency room. Because I'd heard that the ER is haunted by a doctor who used to work there, and he's been seen in there by quite a few people, including customers. It's fascinating to hear some of the things that customers say about this location. So they would say, "Oh, we love the haunted house." Just one thing, the ER doctor, the guy in the emergency room, he was staring at us like he really didn't want us in there, like we were really genuinely unwelcome. You might want to ask him to dial it down a bit. And then the owners have to break it to them that they don't have an ER doctor working in there, It's not an actor at all. So we'd heard that during his lifetime, his reputation was that he was very much do it my way or it's the highway. By the book, I don't tolerate fools, period. Incompetence is not an option. And that's a quality that a lot of ER physicians share, and I think it's actually a very good one to have if it's moderated. So I'd gotten it into my head that if we could perhaps run a simulated cardiac arrest in the emergency room, we might actually be able to get him to interact with us. So when we'd driven out from Colorado, I had borrowed a human-sized and very anatomically realistic mannequin that we use to train medical students, EMTs, paramedics, nurses, those kind of things. And several of the members of my team were paramedics and nurses. So I'd not only had paranormal investigators, but medical professionals along with me too. And so my idea was, what if we ran a simulated cardiac arrest in the emergency room with this mannequin, just as it would have happened for real back when this ER was still functional? And we brought out some old expired IV equipment and some old expired medications like adrenaline and some breathing tubes, everything we would need to actually run a cardiac arrest. But I wanted to do it two ways. So I wanted to do firstly, I wanted to be incompetent across the board. This was what I thought might give me a trigger with the physician. So we would miss our IV lines, we would give the wrong doses of drugs, we would trip over each other, things would not go well. We would get angry at each other, or we simulate getting angry at each other and start snapping and those kind of things. and ultimately, of course, to the patient's detriment. And then the second time, we'd do it flawlessly, just as we would in reality. So we would be cool, calm, collected, get everything right, move like the precise machine that any good hospital resuscitation team actually is. And so we began with the first, what I like to call the Keystone Cops scenario. And I was acting as the physician running the call, so I started to get increasingly pompous and increasingly rude when things weren't going the way I wanted them to go. And my nursing team, my techs were kind of getting a bit heated with me because I was getting heated with them, and we had one of the IV lines got pulled out and squirted saline salt water across another of the, it was like a very bad comedy indeed. And my thought was, the doc is not going to like this, and maybe he will either leave us an EVP or something that expresses his displeasure. But nothing actually happened, and I had investigators surrounding us in the room. We had ringed the walls with cameras, with EMF meters, and all of the various instruments we use to try and capture anomalous activity. And so we took a break at the end. I pronounced the patient dead. I threw down the stethoscope, and I stalked out of the ER, slammed the doors open like a prima donna. And that's where we finished. And I told my crew, good job, guys. All right, let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll do this the right way. And I realized that I'd left my radio down in the security center, which is where they monitor the CCTV cameras. So I went to go fetch it, and it's important to tell you that they wedged the doors open at Asylum 49 because it would be a bad thing if these heavy doors would close on the guests. It's not good to get hit in the face with a heavy wooden door.
No, I would imagine.
So they use these wooden wedges or chocks. And so I walked through a door that, like all the others, had been chopped open for several days now. Went and retrieved my radio. I was the only one in the corridor. Came back, walked through the same door, and just as I cleared it, it sounded like a gunshot. And what it was this door slamming inches behind me after I'd walked through it.
That must have scared the hell out of you.
Oh boy, did it. And so I jumped into the air, kind of turned around. The door was closed. It had been slammed. So where was the wedge? And it had been pitched 4 or 5 feet away after I'd walked through it the first time, and then the second time. So it was open, and I came back through it. It was open. I know I didn't catch it. I didn't graze it. These chocks are wedged in tight to keep the doors open. And it had been thrown away, and the door had slammed. Oh. And my boss was the one that came with me. She's a very senior paramedic, and we've worked together on a number of life and death situations, and she takes great delight in telling people, I've seen Richard literally when the stakes are the highest, and he's fine, he's cool as a cucumber. I heard fear in his voice, and his hands were shaking a little because of the adrenaline dump I had. And the reason is that it was the first time I think ever I felt personally targeted by something which I couldn't see.
Wow, that must have been scary. Did you get anything physically, evidence-wise? Was there an EVP? Anything else that happened at the same time to correlate?
Not during that event. We did get physical results while we were there. One of my investigators experienced 3 very long scratches that ran from her right shoulder blade down to the middle of the back. But that was in a different location, a different part of the hospital. So that night, after I'd kind of had my little scare, my boss was all set to be the doctor for the well-run cardiac arrest, and she took me aside and said, "Look, it's up to you, but I kind of think you might need to make amends here. You've got on somebody's bad side, so why don't you do it right? I'll step down and I'll let you run this one properly." So we did, and after it was done, I apologized to the thin air. I said, no offense was intended. I was simply trying to stimulate a response from you. And boy, did I get one. So we're all healers here. We're all in the same profession. And I apologize for my conduct. Even though I was only acting, I wanted to apologize and just not leave behind any residue of that upset. And the building was totally quiet for the rest of the night.
What was the level of emotion like at that point? Obviously, you were pretty scared. What were the people around you thinking after you told them what happened and what was going on, and after you guys listened to it, of course?
Well, I'd gotten my adrenaline surge, and I just had everybody had said there was nobody else out there in the corridor with you. What's nice about the asylum is that the whole place, when you're locked in, you know that you don't have any human agency that's interfering with you. You don't have somebody that broke in or just wandered in, because there are CCTV cameras all around the perimeter, covering the inside as well as the outside, the entrances, the exits, and the main corridors. So you know that there's no way somebody could have gotten in to mess with you. And what that means is if there was any fraud involved, it would have had to have been every single member of my team all in on it, which of course is ridiculous. And we had them all on video camera anyway. So that leaves you with the fact that somehow this wedge, this wooden shock that was wedged underneath the door, chose that moment to migrate 4 or 5 feet away from the door, just seconds after I passed through it. And that stretches my belief in coincidence to the breaking point.
Would you rank one of those moments as a top 10 for you? How would you rank it?
Yeah, definitely. And the reason for that is, again, we're very clinical when we investigate. And it's not that's also something that is common to the medical profession, where we deal with so many other people's emergencies. We develop this false invincibility complex ourselves, you know. This is never going to happen to me. I treat this kind of thing. I deal with this kind of thing. And when you investigate the paranormal, it's easy to get very clinical as well and say, well, I don't bring this stuff home with me. It doesn't happen to me. This happens to other people, and I investigate it. And that's why I think I got this surge of adrenaline, because I felt very specifically that I had angered someone and that I was being called out for it. I felt that something was mad, it was angry at me specifically.
Now, do you feel, well, there's a difference between anger and bad. Maybe they were trying to make a point. Do you feel that the spirits at the Asylum 49 are good and evil, or is that not even really relative?
I think they're people. I think that you go out into a busy main street, and are the people there good or evil? And the answer is usually a mix of both, right? And that can vary also with any given day. So I think the same is true with dead people. If we're dealing with the spirits of the dead, in this particular case, then you're going to get some that are nicer than others. You'll get some that are cranky. You'll get some that are outright malevolent. And that's true anywhere. We have a real tendency, though, in the paranormal field, at least if we're not careful, that we allow our imaginations to run away with it. And of course, Hollywood hasn't helped with that, has it? Because there are very few movies anymore with nice ghosts and spirits in them. Much as I might like those kind of movies, like The Conjuring and The Grudge and stuff like that, they're fun to watch, you know, and they're fun to have a little chill with. But I don't think it truly reflects the reality of what we're dealing with.
You noted that there was a nearby graveyard. Are the patients, former patients, buried there, or is it just an older cemetery that happened to be nearby?
Well, it's the town cemetery, so I think undeniably former patients are buried there. But the town's populace in general is also buried there.
Quite frankly, I mean, it sounds like the most terrifying place on earth. It's a rundown mental hospital with a graveyard connected, one of those classic mazes like in The Shining. I mean, that's the stuff of nightmares and what horror movies are made of.
Yeah, it certainly does. And again, it's designed that way. You're predisposed to, when you walk in the doors, to have a frightening experience. And I do wonder if that doesn't contribute to the fact that people also have genuine paranormal experiences in Asylum 49, you know? We still don't know how people perceive ghosts. We tend to say somebody saw a ghost, but we're not entirely sure that's correct, are we? There are numerous instances in the literature where a number of people will, say, be touring a historic building, let's say some old castle, 4 or 5 of them see a figure, 9 or 10 of them don't, and you have to wonder, is it simply that the 9 or 10 people didn't notice it? Or is it a case that those 4 or 5 were perceiving with something other than their eyes? So I think that our own perceptions, our own mood, our own mode of thought, all of those things play into our ability to perceive paranormal phenomena.
How do we not know it's a pareidolia or a mental projection, some of these things that have been seen? I mean, you know, for example, you were talking about seeing a shadow in the book that was wearing scrubs. I mean, how do we know that it's not something that, because we know it's a mental hospital, it's something that you're seeing?
You're absolutely right, and I think undeniably in a number of cases that's exactly what's going on. Pareidolia is a very common phenomenon. I think the best example, of course, is the man in the moon. And you also have to guard against the desire to want what you're perceiving to be paranormal. So I think what it means is you need to set your bar for evidence a little higher, and as we like to say, if in doubt, throw it out. But still, there are certain instances in which what's being perceived, it's hard to put any other explanation on it than a paranormal one.
Obviously, we can't give away all the stories. You do got to sell the book a little bit. I'm not going to make you reveal what the secret of Room 66 is. Unless you want to, I won't stop you.
Well, Room 66, well, it's Room 6, actually, but of course, considering the theme of the hospital, they added a couple of extra sixes. But that was home to a patient who, the owners of the hospital actually did trace him through the records. He was a patient who unfortunately was afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. And what's kind of interesting, if you've ever known a patient with Alzheimer's, I think it's one of the cruelest and most horrific diseases out there, because it strips away your very sense of self and your personality. It's horrendous and very, very cruel for the families to have to deal with, to have to cope with that. Anyway, the activity that takes place in this particular room, which is attributed to this former patient with Alzheimer's, some days is very pleasant and cheerful and friendly and welcoming, and you'll get spirit box sessions which match that. You feel kind of welcome in there, especially certain guides. And then other days, it's very much the opposite. It's angry. It can be violent. And in fact, probably the poster child for this was, I don't know if you saw the episode of Ghost Adventures where the team investigated Asylum 49, but this was the room in which Zach Bagans was held against a wall and held there by the entity which haunts the room.
Did you ever have an experience in that room yourself?
We did. I decided it would be a great location to do a spirit box session because although I had a fairly large team, we had 10 investigators in all, this is a hospital. You have so much square footage. You cover what you can with cameras, but you can't hope to put boots on the ground everywhere. You just can't. It's impossible. So you have to cherry pick, and I tend to go based upon the hot spots, the locations which have the most frequency or intensity of activity. And so, considering that the end of the main hallway, which is where room 666 is, and the room itself were both hotspots, it seemed a logical place to begin our experimentation. So we conducted a spirit box session outside that room with several investigators clustered around an SB11. I don't know if are you familiar with that?
Not off the spirit box, yes. The technical, when you give it a technical name, that's where you lose me.
Sure, and we're really just talking about a model number, but the device is a radio frequency hopper, isn't it? That the theory goes that some spirits may be able to piggyback on the space between those frequencies and speak with the living. And I didn't always buy that. There are times I'm still skeptical about what's being heard, but certainly in this particular case, it was an intriguing session. It started out kind of friendly. One good example is that I was watching my team on the monitors from the security center while they did the session, and one of them came to fetch me fairly quickly and said, "Hey, you need to come listen to this. The box is saying your name, and it's also putting on an English accent." So how can I resist? So I went over to join my team, and it did say my name. We recorded that. It mentioned the name of a couple of other investigators that were present as well. And that's when things started to turn, and not for the better. So the session went from being lighthearted and kind of fun to, well, the only really word to use it is obscene. We started to hear some sexual innuendos directed toward one of the female nurses.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I mean, not to crude in your airways, but
no, please do.
but the box told her to bend over and said that it wanted to spank her, whoever was talking through the box, which she did not take that well at all.
So she didn't do it, is what you're saying?
No, she's committed to her job, but not that committed.
Yeah, fair enough.
And so it called her the C word. That totally changes the dynamic, and then once we concluded that session was when we found out a few hours afterwards that one of our investigators had these three long, what's the word I'm looking for, either scrapes or scratches angry red scratches running down from her right shoulder blade to the center of her back. And she felt no burning, no physical indication at the time that she was being scratched at all. But it had happened during that spirit box session or close afterwards.
Wow. Did you happen to have any photographic evidence at that time?
Yes, and we do, and it's in the book, and I'm also happy to send you a copy of that photograph to your listeners if you want to put it on your website either way.
Oh, of course. Let's just continue scaring them. I don't think any of them are going to sleep tonight, quite frankly. Are you ever going to step foot again in Asylum 49? I mean, with all these different experiences, you had something that was possibly attached to you.
Never again. No, I'm kidding. I actually, yes, in 9 days. In 9 days, I fly out, and I'm going to do another week living there over this Halloween.
Oh, fantastic! I'm is your wife happy about that?
She's happy that she gets to stay at home and dog sit.
Oh,
my wife tolerates my passion for the paranormal with the occasional roll of the eyes. She has her hobbies and I have mine. Mine's a little bit more bizarre, I think, than her stuff. But no, I've really come to the conclusion that you have to immerse yourself in a location. It's one thing to go for a night, but to truly understand the rhythms of a building, the way that the air flows through it, the way that the boilers, the pipes, the natural creaks, those kind of noises, it's very difficult to figure out what's normal for a building and what isn't over the space of just a few hours or one evening. So immersion for 5 days or a week it gives you, I think, a much fairer indication of what you're dealing with. And we raised as many questions as we answered during our first long-term investigation there, and that's why we're going back. Going to try a few more experiments and see what the spirits of the asylum have for us this Halloween.
And if spirits are really those are dead people, then they would be, and like you said before, that they would have personalities of people. Not every, for me personally, it sometimes takes a little bit for me to warm up to a person. So I guess that the same would apply when investigating paranormal.
Yeah, I would suspect that's the case if we're dealing with discarnate personality. Sometimes people naturally like one another. Sometimes people naturally dislike one another. What I will definitely do for sure this year, though, is be much less provocative with the emergency room. And because the labor and delivery ward is very active, what I plan to do this year is I'll be taking a birthing simulator with me. And my idea for that is, now we've covered the cardiac arrest angle of things. Now I'd like to cover the opposite. I'd like to cover what happens if we are to simulate some births in the emergency room. Will we get any activity then? I'm sorry, in the obstetric wing.
How many people are you going with? How big is the group?
Taking a team of 12 this time, and still I could take twice that many. But if any of your listeners happen to be in the neighborhood over the Halloween weekend, come on by, and not only will we be investigating the place late at night, but I'll be more than happy to chat and sign copies of the book for anybody that would like one.
You might be bum rushed a little bit. Why don't you tell people your contact information, your social media, all that good stuff, where they can get the book, so they can get in touch with you?
Sure, come visit me online if you'd like to. I'd love to talk to you. My email address is richard@richardestep.net, and that's my website, www.richardestep.net. That's Richard, ESTEP.net. Or you can also go to asylum49.com and see some of the photographic evidence and hear some of the EVPs posted there. Make up your own mind.
And we know that you're going back there in a few days. I'm sure you'll add some more evidence there. What can we expect next from you? Are we going to get another Asylum 50 somewhere else? What can we expect?
Well, I just finished a book called Spirits of the Cage, which involves the week I spent living in England's witches' prison. It was where the accused were kept during the English equivalent of the Salem witch trials during 1580, that period there. And then this November, I move into the former home of one of America's most notorious serial killers, the I-70 Strangler. That's called Fox Hollow Farm, where he killed and buried a number of his victims, and I'll be investigating the haunting of that location.
You live quite the interesting life, my friend. That's it sounds fascinating. Quite frankly, I might have to tag along one of these days when you're near me in the area.
Yeah, hit me up, and we'll see what we can do.
All right, wonderful. Richard Estep, fantastic job. All right, guys, go get some candy corn. Come right back. We'll be back with retired officer Lauren Christensen.